Good evening. Welcome to the Parkland Institute's 24th annual conference after the contagions. My name is Marie Carrière, and I am a board member of the Parkland Institute and Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. We are very pleased to have hundreds of people joining us again this evening from across Alberta and across the country. I want to start by thanking all of our conference sponsors. Without their support, we would not have been able to host this conference. They are the Alberta Federation of Labour, the Alberta Public Interest Research Group, Athabasca University, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, Civic Service Union Local 52, the Non-Academic Staff Association, NASA at the U of A, United Nurses of Alberta, the University of Alberta's Faculty of Arts, and the Wordsworth Irvine Socialist Fellowship Endowment. The Health Sciences Association of Alberta has also made a special contribution that will allow our keynote talks to be edited and posted to the Parkland Institute's YouTube channel. I also want to thank the media sponsors for their help in promoting our conference, Alberta Views Magazine and CJSR Radio Edmonton. Finally, I would like to personally extend my congratulations to the conference organizers, particularly Trevor Harrison and Bill Kilgannon. Parkland is proud to be part of the Faculty of Arts at the U of A. However, the Institute depends largely on the support of our individual donors and our contributing organizations and unions to fund our research and education programs. We thank the many of you who already support Parkland. We are asking any of you who are able to consider making a one-time contribution or better yet, to become a regular monthly contributor. Please click on the link in the chat if you are able to contribute. We really need a strong Parkland Institute to address all of the cuts and the challenges in Alberta. A few technical logistics for this evening. As on previous nights, the Zoom chat feature is available so participants can make comments to other attendees. Please note that neither I nor Armine will be following the chat, but we do have staff who will be monitoring it and making sure people are being respectful and adding in links and other information that may be of interest to you. For those of you who want to have a conversation on Twitter, please use the conference hashtag ParkConf. Following Armine's keynote talk tonight, we will open things up for questions from our conference participants. If you hover your mouse over your screen, you will see a Q&A button. This is where you can write your questions. Please make them as succinct as possible. There's also a feature where you can promote a question that you think is particularly interesting or similar to the question you would like to ask. Before I introduce Armine, I'd like to start this evening with a treaty and land acknowledgement. In recognizing where we are, and especially where the University of Alberta is located, I'd like to acknowledge that the City of Edmonton is on Treaty 6 territory, of which the city and its citizens have enjoyed the benefits of treaty. We acknowledge and honor all our ancestors, traditions, and spirit of this gathering place that first drew Indigenous peoples, the Cree, Nakota, Dene, Blackfoot, Métis, and then settlers to this special place. We acknowledge the spirit of the ancient and great gathering place in our river valley, in the heart of our city, that has for thousands of years been a peaceful and spiritual gathering place for trade, ceremony, and celebration. We acknowledge the traditions of trade and commerce that drew settlers here and enabled the forging of relationships that saw the creation of Treaty 6, the province of Alberta, and the city of Edmonton. And we acknowledge and honor that we still reside on Treaty 6 territory and together call upon those honored traditions and the spirit and intent of treaty to maintain us in a stronger and lasting relationship. And so now I have the honor of introducing Armine Yalnizyan. Armine Yalnizyan is a leading voice on Canada's economic scene and is the Atkinson Foundation's Fellow on the Future of Workers. She served as Senior Economic Policy Advisor for the Deputy Minister at Employment and Social Development Canada from 2018 to 2019. She helped lead the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Inequality project from 2008 to 2017 and provided weekly business commentaries on CBC Radio and CBC TV from 2011 to 2018. She is past president of the Canadian Association for Business Economics, and she is here this evening to deliver her talk. And so please welcome Armine.
Thank you so much, Marie. And I want to say that I'm speaking to you all from unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory. It is an honor to be part of the river of life that has settled here and attends to both the planet and the people around us and helps us, this process of reconciliation and understanding who we are, where we are, and who we are with, helps us understand and re-understand what it is that we are doing with our lives. And I hope this presentation tonight will be a little contribution to that too, because I think shift is happening. Shift happens all the time, but it's happening now and in a remarkable way. And whether it causes cynicism or celebration is partly up to us to shape. And that's really the central message of my presentation. The topic of my contribution to this remarkable series that you've been having this week is about economics, but it's about more than just growth and recession. It's about the big reset that we're in the midst of, and how I hope you will take some heart in what's going on, despite some of the very awful things that are also going on right now. So I want to give you a sense of where we're going to be together in the next few minutes, and also that we're going to have a party at the end with cake. But before we get there, I want to explain to you why the moment we're in stems from inequality, gives rise to more inequality, and is an opportunity for a big reset. I want to reveal to you what the pandemic revelation about the essential economy really is founded on, which is the caring economy is what props up the essential economy. I want to make sure we walk through and kind of sit with the potential for both celebration and cynicism, and how tense the future is, because we could go down two very different paths from where we're at right now. And finally, I want to end with the really central idea that shift is happening, it has happened, it will happen, and we could actually shape a future that shifts towards a more non-profit driven reality, a more human-centered reality. And the shape of that shift is absolutely in our hands and in our spirits, as Marie was talking. It really struck me how the spirit-driven approach makes a huge difference if we acknowledge that we are all driven by emotion and will and our understanding of the world. So let's stop for a minute and think about what is it that we know about economics right now, and what do we know about what's happening in Alberta? And I'm going to start with a little trip down memory lane. One of the first times I spoke to Parkland was in March of 1999, and back then, Ralph Klein hated what I had to say, because what I had to say was that inequality was growing more rapidly in Alberta than in any other province in Canada. That was in 1999. We just moved from one place to another, and I had a box full of clippings, and I had this great clipping from the Edmonton Sun. I was on the front page of the newspapers in a he said, she said battle for days, and the upshot of that was the Parkland almost lost its funding, thanks to me. The magicians that were at the Parkland managed to get Ralph Klein to climb down from his tree and not defund the Parkland because of things I was saying that are based on objective reality. In fact, I hadn't done the research. I was simply reporting on research that others had done. And this is what it looks like. Part of inequality is about the Gini coefficient, which you've heard about. Oops, Is somebody else doing this? Claire, get your fingers off my cursor. Part of inequality is about the Gini coefficient and the distribution around the middle. But really what we're talking about often when we talk about inequality is not just poverty, but also poverty and the other end of the income spectrum, the top 1%. Here you'll see Alberta's top 1%, and the share of total income in the province that accrued to the top 1% is demarcated in black. Canada is in red, and Ontario, which used to be one of the worst, it was demarcated in green. Our data don't go back before 1982. Starting in 1982, Alberta's top 1% had the biggest share of total income of any province, followed by Ontario. But there was quite a big gap between Alberta and Ontario. Then we get to 1988 because the oil price, the National Energy Program and all sorts of other things did upset the apple cart. The role of the top 1% changed in Alberta by 1988. But then look what happened in the next 3 decades. From 1988 to 1998, we saw almost a doubling of the share that the top 1% took. And no other province or jurisdiction in Canada saw anything like that. And then flash forward another 10 years from when I was castigated by Premier Klein, it really grew rapidly. By far, the biggest, the most dominant top 1% in any province in Canada. But then we get to 2018. These data just came out yesterday, and they're the latest we have. We don't have 2019 data on annual incomes. And these data show that the incredible battering your economy took because of the decline of oil prices. But still, notwithstanding that, the degree of ownership of total income in Ontario that is commanded by the top 1% remains the most striking in Alberta. Now I want to show you what happened at the other end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, I'm not going to go to the bottom 1% or even the bottom 10%. I'm talking about the bottom 50%. Here you'll see that the bottom 50% wasn't doing all that well in 1982 when these data series first started. But by the time we get to 1988, the bottom half of the economy in Alberta was doing pretty well, commanded a pretty good share, comparatively speaking, of total income. That share fell rapidly by 1998 and then by 2008. But it has started to rise again in 2018. You'll see virtually every jurisdiction has seen an increase in the share of total income of the people that live in the bottom half of the income spectrum. And the reason for that is because of extremely generous increases in child benefits through the federal tax system and jurisdictions like Alberta that raised minimum wages, boosting the economy from the bottom up. So public policy can make a huge difference as to what share of the economy the bottom half of the distribution can get. Now I want to show you how shift happens. So I'm now comparing just Alberta's top 1% and bottom 50%. You've just seen it in the previous charts. But when I show it to you this way, you see something really quite remarkable, don't you? The black line is the top 1%. The red line is the bottom 50%. Back in 1982, the bottom 50% commanded a bigger share of your total income in Alberta than the top 1%. That change grew even more dramatic by 1988. But by 1998, the top 1% commanded the same as 50 times more people. 50 times more people, and they commanded the same share of the total income. And then by 2008, you see that they commanded even more of a share of the income than the bottom half of the population, Alberta. But fast forward again another decade to 2010, and it's shifting again, where there's far more equanimity than there had been in the previous 2 decades. So you see, shift does happen. It goes in both directions, though. And what we do really does shape how shift shapes. The next slide is about how we pay for Alberta, and this is the tax story. And it is always the case that the rich pay more taxes and a bigger share of taxes than the bottom, because at the bottom end of the distribution, you have a lot of people that don't make enough money to pay any taxes at all. In fact, Canada-wide, it's 38% of all tax filers that don't pay any taxes. There's a big deal here about the top paying, by 2008, the top 1% is paying almost a third of all the income taxes in Alberta. That's really saying something. It's slightly over double what it was in 1988. But then remember, they have more than double the share of income. And similarly, the share that of taxes paid by the bottom half is very low, and it doesn't vary very much. But when it starts going up is when this group, the bottom 50%, starts getting more income. So when the top 1% tells you, but we're already paying most of the taxes, certainly an outsized share for the size of our population, you should remember two things. The reason they're paying more is because they're making a bigger share of total income. But secondarily, you should also remember the tax the rich trope does have limits. That's why you got a tax revolt, because the top 1% was paying so very much of the revenues that governments rely on. So it's a double-edged sword for sure. Now I want to talk about a bigger picture story than just inequality. And it is the context of the reset we're in right now. It preceded the pandemic, but the pandemic is pouring accelerant on this phenomenon. And the phenomenon is what I like to call sloth, which is slow or no growth, which is very different than a recession, but it's also a very different backdrop to what we do and why we do it, economically speaking. And here's the picture I want you to understand. This chart goes right back to the end of the Second World War. And since the end of the Second World War, the holy grail of every government is to be able to say we brought growth to the jurisdiction that they are in. Now, if you look at this line here, can you see my cursor? This line here is 0. It means that the economy did not grow at all. And the parts we usually focus on are these parts, the parts that fall below 0. The historic series doesn't go past 2017, so you don't see how deep the drop is in GDP, and we won't know it for a few more months yet in 2020. But you can see that we've only had 4 major recessions since the end of the Second World War. And we spent so much time talking about recession. What we don't talk about is the way the economy varies around this red line, which shows that the economy has been gradually slowing over time. And this is not a temporary phenomenon. This is a very long-term phenomenon, and it is not going away anytime soon because of this population aging. This is an even longer term chart. And I promise you, it won't just be charts all night long. We will have cake. I promise you we'll have cake by the end of the night. This chart goes back to 1921. And I want you to see it because we talk a lot about the, not passing debt onto our kids and not saddling our kids with difficulties. The picture of 1921 to 2061, this area here, the brighter area, is the actual data of the proportion of the population that the working age population has to support. So it grows to a peak in the baby boom years because this bright area here is the kids that are too young to work, under the age of 15. The gray area are people that are deemed too old to work, over the age of 65. Now it's true that more people that are 65 and older are still working some, but we're not going to have a bunch of 85-year-olds working, but we will have a bunch of 85-year-olds in a few years. And that's the part that's the most disturbing going forward is we've had decades of fertility rates falling. And that means very few people born in Canada are entering the labor market going forward. And it's kind of steady because we're not even at the replacement rate of the population. But these people that were born here, these kids are now exiting the labor market here. These are the boomers leaving the labor market. And so the children that we are relying on today to support the boomers of tomorrow who are too old to work are few in number. And that is why we are going to need all hands on deck. And really, that is the heart of what I've been talking about since March. It's not only the she-covery and the she-cession we need to worry about, which is quite unique to this economic downturn, but it's the future. We need to think about the fact that what these kids of today are going to do to support everybody that is too young, too old, and too sick to work. That is happening in the context of slower economic growth, as the chart I just showed you, and the fact that there's fewer people coming in to take the jobs of the people who are leaving. I know it's really hard to think about right now because there's so much unemployment. But if you'll remember that just before the pandemic hit, month after month, we were hearing in both Canada and the US that unemployment rates were at the lowest they had been since records started being kept in the 70s in the same way. You actually have to go back to the 50s and 60s to see similarly low unemployment rates. And that's in an era where only one person worked per household. Now the norm is 2 people working per household. So you know that something very big is happening. And the something that is very big that is happening is this story here. More people are exiting the labor market than are coming into it. And yes, we are increasing the number of immigrants and migrant workers that are coming in to do the work that, but there is going to be a huge issue that is going to go on for decades. And that is something that we need to think about as we develop our policies to get ourselves out of recession and the pandemic and to put us on the right track for the future. And now I'm going to pour pandemic economics on this. This is the employment rate for Alberta for all workers, men and women aged over 15. The women's line is the red line, the men's line is the black line. The black line, this is unadjusted seasonal data. You can see men really vary in their employment rate throughout the course of the year, but nobody has seen this kind of reduction. You will also note that men's employment rate generally, while very, very high, has been, this goes back to 1976, has been kind of going down. This is the first recession of 81, 82. This is the second recession of 90, 91. Then we have another recession here, 2008. And now this one. We've never seen anything like it, really. Men's employment rate has never been this low in Alberta. And by the way, both men and women have a higher employment rate in Alberta than in almost any other jurisdiction. You guys work really hard and expect each other to work really hard. Now I want to bring us to the women's chart. This is all women aged 15 and up. And you will see it steadily increases right up to 2008. 2008 is a hit for everybody everywhere, and you come down there too, women of Alberta. But then you rise up again a bit, and then you come down again because of the oil price shock. But again, this level of employment here, which is less than 50% of the women's population. It's the same as it was back in the late 1970s. Now we rebounded. This figure here, where we're at in October, is the same level we were at in 1985. But it is not necessarily going to stay there. And that takes me to the next story. So we know the pandemic is expected to really hit the economy hard. And the hardest part of the economy to be hit is household spending. That's expected to decline by 9% this year. I'm going to come back to that later. They're not getting back on their feet. For example, restaurants and bars, they're shutting down again. Most large retailers are doing okay. The small businesses are operating on small margins. That's always been the case. So there were a lot of marginal businesses going into the pandemic, and many of them are not going to last. In fact, Dan Kelly of the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses says there's a lot of deaths out there. They just haven't had the funeral yet. It's estimated that about a third of small businesses are facing closure now. That might get worse. It certainly will reshape Main Street in all of our cities, and it's going to reshape all of our communities. And of course, the next shoe to fall may be unpayable levels of household and commercial debt, and perhaps unmanageable municipal finances. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, because the real story here is that our GDP depends on mommies and kids achieving their maximum potential. So before the pandemic hit, and I just saw a note, somebody saying, has anybody thought that maybe the economy is the problem and the way we think about it is the problem? Well, sure. But before we start slagging it, let's understand the problems that we face collectively if we're actually blocking our way to any kind of resumption of normality. And I fully understand that normal is not where we want to head. We want to head someplace better than normal. But pre-pandemic, about 57% of our economy was driven by household spending. And it's families that are young that have children who are the biggest block of spenders in the entire economy. They make up over a third of all households, but they spend more than any other type of family per household. And within those households, the family income of families that have kids, moms make up 40% of that income. So mathematically speaking, and macroeconomically speaking, there can be no recovery without a she-covery. And there can be no she-covery without childcare. And I'm going to get to another point here about childcare not being warehousing kids, but actually investing in their capacity to learn. So it's early learning and childcare is incredibly important when we talk about how are we going to get out of this funk. Because of that chart I showed you, that great big blue chart that shows that for decades we're dealing with the working age population having to prop up an historically elevated level of people too old, too young, and too sick to work. So we can't afford to discount the potential to learn and earn of our poorest kids. And that ranges between 10% and 30% of communities, depending on what kind of a community you're talking about. So we are looking at the potential for women's gains in the paid workforce to be rolled back by decades. This is a chart that shows that parents in particular are having a tough time getting back into the labor market. And remember, before the pandemic hit, women accounted for half of all the people on payroll in Canada. And it's not just losing a job, it's losing hours of paid work. Lots of people are working less than half their previous hours. It's the moms and parents that are having trouble getting back to work because of childcare and school being unpredictable. In September, for the first time in decades, women's labor force participation rates declined while men's increased, and that happened again in October. The reason I keep talking about the she-cession is not just about moms getting back to work, it's about the macro economy. It's about how we all are able to fare, because if women can't get back to work and their households lose purchasing power, then they can't buy stuff. That means somebody without any kids, somebody living on their own, their jobs are impacted. It's all about purchasing power. And the longer we prevent people from getting back to work, the deeper the recession is going to be. And we're not doing anything about the one part that could actually be policy amenable, which is safe schools and good childcare. I just want to enforce that the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be for people to get back on their feet again. It's not only a massive loss of human potential, livelihood in the short term, it's also a huge draw, like pullback, drag on our economic potential and our potential as a society in the long term. Some of you may know people that have lost their jobs. I bet a lot of you don't. 60% of the labor force didn't feel a thing in this pandemic. So the majority of people didn't feel anything economically, but the ones that have, my God, it's the biggest group of people that have been affected, that have been sidelined because of a pandemic or any kind of economic shock. And they're having the toughest time getting back in once they're out. So why the jurisdictions like Alberta, like Ontario, like Quebec, the ones that are so intent on reopening, so intent on recovery, so intent on getting back to normal, why are they so blind to this reality? Because the longer they do nothing, the higher the prices that we're all paying for this. You're going to get the people that said, but how can we afford to do anything? Childcare is so expensive. Well, irony alert. In Quebec, which introduced $5 a day childcare in 1997. This is well over a decade after they introduced the program. A couple of economists noted by 2008, for every $100 the Quebec government put into childcare, they generated a return of $104 of new personal income taxes for the government of Quebec. And the federal government, that didn't put in a thin dime, got $43 for every $100 the Quebec government put in. Why? Because more people are working. Wait, there's more. Now we get the second gift absolutely free, because it isn't just about returns on mommy's labor. We have 25 years of evidence, more in some cases, that shows that for every dollar you put in to early learning and childcare, for kids that might be at risk of entering school not learning ready or not supported as they go through school to be able to keep up, for every dollar put into these programs, the return is between $4 and $8. This is brain dead. We shouldn't be talking about how much it costs. We should be asking ourselves, why aren't we doing this? And why aren't we doing this lickety split? Because it isn't just the recovery and the recovery from the pandemic that we have to worry about. It's how are we going to deal with the future? And I have to say, I am unclear on what is going to happen next for you guys, because it was just yesterday that New York City closed all their public schools because they had a 3% positivity rate. Alberta now is at an 8% positivity rate with their tests. It's outstripping Ontario and Quebec in terms of a per capita infection rate. So what threshold would your schools move into shutdown mode? And why isn't the government of Alberta making some kind of declarations? Why is it devolving these decisions to school boards and to individual childcare centers? Because, if we don't do something systematically, women's employment rate could absolutely go back to 1985 levels or worse. And that is going to hobble the entire economy. And by the way, what the heck is going on with your childcare system? Like, what is going on there with this law that was just the bill that was just brought in, Bill 39? It's mind-boggling. In fact, I think there's some kind of mutual playbook that's going on in Ontario and in Alberta, and we should actually check out the language of the legislation, because they're increasing class sizes. They're reducing certification of early childhood educators. They're doing weird things about licensing in your province, where somebody that's got a license can hand their license over to somebody else. It's like, you can't do that with your driver's license. Why should you be able to do that with how you take care of our youngest learners? So we've got a real problem here, and we need to step up our demand that our governments actually do their job instead of devolve it and let the economy fall in a heap all around it. Here's what it looks like for women who have school-age kids and preschoolers. Women aged 25 to 54, you do not want us to end up here, ladies and gentlemen. None of your families want this to happen. It's not a good story for men, don't get me wrong. The story for men is not beautiful either. So these are prime age workers. They're neither young workers, they're not youth, and they're not people on the verge of retiring. This is your prime age worker, and you want to make sure these people get back in the saddle to take care of themselves and to take care of their children. And that might not happen because of incompetent governance. Let's make sure that that doesn't happen. And let me just get to the next chapter of this presentation, which is that the big reveal of COVID is not just that it wasn't, we're all in this together, it's the great equalizer. It is not the great equalizer. It revealed huge inequalities. It also revealed the essential economy is propped up by the caring economy. You cannot do GDP without doing care. And the irony is that the caring economy, what I mean by the caring economy is healthcare, childcare, elder care, and learning. Education from preschool right through to post-secondary and lifelong learning. Now, unpaid care for healthcare, childcare, and elder care, particularly childcare and elder care, is mostly done by women. And it's even more done by women as unpaid work due to the pandemic. So what's the solution there? More paid work or more time off, more paid time off? Well, in Alberta, neither is the answer. And when it comes to paid care, it's also done mostly by women, and it's almost always undervalued. Did you know that we are on the brink of celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Royal Commission, the report on the Royal Commission on the Status of Women? That happens on December the 7th. And we've been talking about the need for childcare, and we've been talking about caregivers getting paid less and valued less than zookeepers for half a century. Pay equity is a 100-year-old concept. When are we going to get the work that women do in the caring economy valued as important? I'll tell you, in Ontario, the province of Ontario also doesn't collect statistics. So we can't track what's going on province-wide. But the city of Toronto said that only 37% of the spaces in its regulated childcare were operating. If I was the Minister of Transportation, or even the mayor of Toronto, and I told my citizens, only 37% of your roads and bridges are functioning, you would know that you had an economic problem on your hands. You would know that your workers couldn't come to work. You would know that you, as a business, you couldn't get your supplies in and your shipments out, and you would demand something be done. Well, here we are, we're on the verge of exactly the same thing happening to our social infrastructure rather than our physical infrastructure. And the response from government is crickets. So we need to say we are talking about vital social infrastructure, and we expect it to be there because you expect us to be propping up more and more people who are too old, too young, and too sick to work. Do not preach to me about passing on a debt to the next generation. Let me do my job and stop blocking, stop failing to act on the choke points that are in my way. Okay, I'm going to stop ranting there, because these two things, population aging and this chart about where we could be heading in terms of employment, can be both cause for celebration or cynicism. Look, we are being presented with a remarkable, historic, never before opportunity to really put flesh on the bones of what it means to have inclusive growth, to boost the economy from the bottom up, to actually invest in the human potential that is in our midst, to reduce systemic barriers, to actually invite everybody to come to the table and to do their best for themselves, and in so doing for everybody. That is a bona fide result of population aging and of the pandemic making really clear what we need to be our best selves. But it's also, given what is happening with governments like the government of Alberta and the government of Ontario, other governments as well, there is cause for cynicism. This could not be more clear what we can do to overcome the current problem and actually prepare ourselves for the future. And we have seen other jurisdictions like Germany and New Zealand, South Korea, and Denmark deal with these problems in a really holistic, collective way, and reducing the amount of pain, death, and economic devastation. So we know it can be done. Why it's not being done is not clear to me. But what we have also learned is that great public and community services save money and improve lives. And it's just what your grandmother has always told you. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That is as true in public health nostrums as it is in the economy. It's just as true for people's life of service to others, both paid and unpaid. You help somebody become their best self, and you reap far more than what you sow. But you don't do anything, and you reap exactly what you sow. Nothing. In fact, more cost. I'm heading towards the end of my presentation, but a couple of things I want to say. First of all, there is a big shift happening. You must be feeling it, eh? It seems to be everywhere. The last 40 years, we have been hearing that the best thing governments can do is encourage more market and do less government, get out of the way. And the top policy priority has been about attracting capital, attracting investment, maximizing profit and growth. Very profit driven, very money focused. All about trickle down policies. Give more money to the rich and they will make wealth happen because they know what they're doing. The pandemic plus population aging is making very clear that the next 40 years we are likely to be seeing a bigger government role. For people that are really pro small government, they're going to have a heck of a time wrapping their heads around their small government position is going to mean that they are basically saying to people too old, too young, and too sick to work that you get nothing. That's not a vote getter. So we are looking at a bigger government role one way or another. And the top policy priority, because of population aging, and that is happening all around the world, we're going to be fighting to get more immigrants. We're going to be actually looking to become people magnets, just like we were looking to be money magnets, capital magnets in the last 40 years. The next 40 years is, can we attract enough people to do the work that needs to be done? And that should include the potential for talking about maximizing human potential and wellness. So much more of a human focus, much more of a planetary focus too. The point being, instead of it being trickled down, we're starting to see more evidence of how solid policies that boost the economy from the bottom up, like raising the minimum wage, like providing child benefits, like providing childcare, how they do boost the economy from the bottom up. But there is a tension going forward because slowing economic growth means that investors that have got big bags of money are not getting the returns they once did. And by the way, the investors with big bags of money include public pensions. So they're looking for higher returns. And one way of doing it is gambling. So you get higher returns, but that's risky. So you need to offset the high risk gambles with no risk gambles, risk-free income streams, and also by lowering, like increasing the margins by lowering labor costs and increasing profits. That's why your public utilities are in the headlights. That's why you are hearing so much about privatizing public services and contracting out the costs to reduce costs, apparently to taxpayers, but it's going to make somebody a lot of money. On the other side is the slowing growth in purchasing power, because you've got the biggest cohort in history of people on fixed and low incomes. And they really don't want to see prices go up. And they are voters. So another way of dealing with these pressures is to improve social wages. Maybe not a wage paid to workers, but better social wages like public goods, like better childcare, pharmacare, mental health care, dental and vision, internet, better housing and more affordable housing. This small bundle of things literally puts money in your pocket because you're spending less on these things. And maybe even less working time is a solution too. But this, it's the opposite of saying more market is the solution to everything. It's actually saying what we need to do is contain costs and improve quality of the things we all need to consume to just get from one day to the next. We're almost at the cake. This isn't the cake I'm offering you. We're almost at the cake though. What I want you to understand is, even though for my entire life as an economist, I had heard the expression, we should want to bake a bigger pie. The economy is not a pie. It's a layer cake. And this is Hazel Henderson's genius in 1982, where she made it clear that the economy is founded on the planet, on the love economy, and then we start talking about the things that we normally talk about when we talk about GDP. And, all those people that talk about the innovation economy and all that sort of stuff, productivity improvements, that's the icing on the cake. You can't do any of that unless you've got a functional planet, you've got people that are educated, you've got functioning infrastructure systems that prop up businesses for everybody. And then we can get going on how we're going to tweak those businesses to make them even better and shinier than they are now. Now, critical to this is that the caring economy is fundamental to the essential economy, and that it will be growing in size as the population aging accelerates, and that is happening globally. So that's actually part of where the future of work comes from, not from technology, but from caring. And now I want to introduce you to the cake.
Conventional economics knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing. The convention is to talk about growing a bigger economic pie. Who doesn't want more pie? But why would you settle for pie when you could have layer cake with icing on it? The fundamental layer of the cake has got to be how the planet is doing, because it's the source of all the raw materials. Then the next layer is how we take care of one another. And it's on top of those two things that you can build a physical infrastructure. And then on top of that is actually the economy that we usually talk about, none of which is possible without the previous layers. But we only ever talk about the top layer. The beginning of the 20th century starts with 2 wars and a depression. At the end of it, people recognized that human development and security was incredibly important for well-being. There was a really vigorous debate between, does human development create economic growth, or does economic growth facilitate human development? But around the beginning of the 1980s, the primary public policy has been growing the economy. You give the people that know how to create wealth more money so they can create more wealth for everybody. Yes, they created more wealth, but they kept more wealth. We were told that there was some kind of organic reason for it rather than greed, or the fact that wealthy people can change the rules, and they do. They shield themselves from risk, from financial risk, from social responsibilities, because they're too important to be permitted to fail, and everybody else pays for their failures. But when they succeed, they don't share it. An argument for free markets without also robust public provisions is an argument for inequality. Free market fundamentalists are blind to the other layers that support them. What we have really learned is that my survival depends on your survival. Building up the floor of supports will build up the economy. Better public services and paying people a living wage at the floor of the economy will boost the economy from the bottom up and make people more resilient for whatever happens to them, make them more willing to be innovative and entrepreneurial. None of that is possible in a pie. So why would you settle for pie when you could have cake?
Thanks very much for inviting me to serve you cake.
Thank you so much, Armine, for that great thought-provoking keynote. We will open up the session now to questions. We will start with a question from Minal, who asks about the bottom 50% in Alberta in 2018. So one of the charts, earlier part of the talk. So Minal is asking, do you think that the rise in the share of the bottom 50% in Alberta in 2018 was only due to the federal incentives or also the Alberta NDP policies?
I think it was due to both, and I had hoped that I was pretty clear in talking about both childcare and minimum wage. The minimum wage policy of the NDP was quite remarkable. It did come from Alberta. We were just starting to see the impact of 2008. That wasn't the only policy, of course, that the NDP government of Alberta put into place, but the combination of policies at the federal and the provincial level really lifted up a lot of people, really reduced a lot of poverty, and lifted up the well-being of the bottom half of the population of Alberta, especially families with kids. We know good policy makes a difference.
Thank you very much. The next question is a comparative question between New York and Alberta and the problem of school closures and the ability to work. And so this is from Ahmed Safar, who says this: I'm surprised with the differences in percentage of COVID rate between New York and Alberta, and the fact that New York has closed schools and they are at a lower percentage than Alberta. I have a question related to this. Will the closing of schools affect the families' abilities to continue working, or should there be a solution to that problem too? Working from home is one solution, but so far it has been optional and doesn't apply to many sectors.
Thank you for that question. In fact, all around the world, it seems to be pretty consistent. Only about 40%, 4 in 10 workers can work from home. Most of the work we do is done in a place. It's not optional to do it from home. So a very small, it's a significant minority, but not everybody can work from home. With respect to people that are going to be unable to work because the schools have shut down in the US, you know, that country is going through something horrific right now with their federal government being unable or unwilling to help the people. In Canada, we are lucky that if we have school closures, we also have 3 programs of federal income support, that if you can't work because of COVID, you got income support. At least until we get through the pandemic, that is something we can rely on. But in the United States, the same story is not there. It might be after January, but the schools are closed now. And there's a lot of people that are living in unspeakably difficult situation. Another part of your question was, is there something that can be done about the situation in Alberta or Ontario? And the fact is, we have so many examples to draw from on how to do safe school reopening. And yet public health guidance is not being followed for reasons I do not understand. We do know how to do this, and we do know how to do this So it's systemic. It isn't like every school board goes off in a different direction. That we actually have public health guidance that says at a certain infection rate, you can take the following measures, and certainly more spacing and more outdoor activities should be part of the norm. I don't know how we're going to do this going forward if we're not going to pay attention to the science, but that's another part of the solution.
Thank you, Armine. We have a question from Anahi Johnson, who asks this. The 11,000 workers slated to lose their jobs in Alberta is purported to be a cost-saving measure. Is there evidence that privatizing laundry, housekeeping, lab, dietitian services saves money? These are roles primarily held by women who will subsequently make less and have fewer benefits.
Well, that's the story. Yes, they save money on the sheet. If you're paying somebody less, you're saving money. But then the person that you're paying less to has less money to spend. So what might work for an individual company is suicide at a system-wide level. Because the problem we're having now is that people don't have enough money. And when they don't have enough money, they end up moonlighting. They end up exposing themselves to even bigger and bigger spheres of risk. This is what we learned from the long-term care facilities in Quebec and Ontario, is that facilities that are trying to keep costs down and do so by giving workers shifts that are just low enough that they don't trigger benefits. And those workers have to go and, go to 2 or 3 different employers to be able to get enough hours because of the low rate of pay to be able to pay their bills. So you're setting up a system. Yeah, you're going to save costs to the public purse, but you're reducing purchasing power in the economy, and you're creating whole new vectors of problems with disease transmission risk, which seems it just seems stupid to me. There's this kind of brain split that is going on in some jurisdictions where the economy is seen as something antithetical to health. And we've said over and over again, we can have a better economy that gets back to normal once we get the pandemic under control. So cutting costs now is actually going to make the pandemic last longer. It's the opposite of what we need.
Thank you. We have a question here from Aline. Do you have guidance for actions individuals can take now to attempt to improve these outcomes? We are often told that voting is our most powerful tool, but given how rapidly our supports are eroding in Alberta, waiting for our next election does not seem viable. Given how urgent the impacts of COVID are, what can be done now to attempt to shift policy to protect the vulnerable and create the recovery we want?
I think that there is a real opportunity here for collective action. I think the last time I talked to Parkland was in the wake of the 2008 recession. The response to 2008 led to this huge movement. It was the first movement that I had seen in decades, even though I grew up with, the women's movement and the green movement and the gay movement. There was so much movement in society when I was growing up. Thank you, Occupy Wall Street. Yes, thank you, everybody that's out there that is helping me, prod me along. But Occupy didn't really lead to anything. And then after Trump talked about grabbing a woman by the pussy when you are so powerful that you can do that, we had the Pussy Hat March. And then we had the Me Too movement. And then we had the Black Lives Matter movement. And we had the Fight for 15 movement. Like, there have been so many movements. My friends, it is up to us to decide what engages us, inflames our ardor, helps us shape the future we are looking for, because we are giving voice to the things that we want. I don't know what the collective actions are that are already bubbling up in Alberta, but I have no doubt. I certainly know that the childcare movement is gaining some amount of support to resist the insane piece of legislation that is being tabled right now. So that's something you can get engaged if that's of interest. But there's so much that's going on in your province right now, like left, right, and center. There's so many ways to get engaged. My advice to you would be, whatever it is that makes you craziest, find like-minded people and work together. to at least put some options on the table. It's not just saying no to what the government is doing. It's actually saying, and we can do this. No to that and yes to this. And start defining the world you want, what it is you're fighting for.
Thank you, Armine. The next question is from Mireille Cagne. Would like to hear you speak to what you think is the rationale of the UCP government cutting funding for early child education.
You're asking the wrong person. I think it is the most incomprehensible thing I can imagine. I really don't know. That the only thing I can think of is that potentially there are big box operators that see a way of making money, and it's a way of actually eliminating some operators. And then of course you need to do something about childcare, so these big chains come into town. But that's a bit far-fetched to me. Like, it just seems like, I'm sorry, I do not know the answer to your question. It is perplexing to me. It seems like the height of policy incompetence. But this is obviously not about policy, so I do not understand the mind of the UCP government. Don't they still have that $30 million war room too, while they're busy cutting costs elsewhere? So look, I don't understand how they make the choices that they do.
Thank you, Armine. The next question is from Mike Parker. Globally, we see a shift to right-wing politics that insists on pie over cake. Society believes in pie, even though they should be looking at cake. What would you say to the bottom 50% that think pie is the way to show them the difference and the impact?
Oh, geez, I wish I had a quick answer for you. I thought I was being so clever repeating Hazel Henderson's. I am willing to hear what your answer is when you start thinking about it. I think people get it. I think people have forgotten that everything's connected, that we're building something here layer by layer. And what happens in the previous layer is going to determine the height of the cake, the taste of the cake, the shape of the cake. So it's a bit of a cheesy metaphor, to stick with food metaphors. I don't know how you convince people other than the more you tell them that the work that they're doing and the work that the planet does for free is part of what makes an economy go round. Everybody gets it. Talked about is normal, right? We only talk about the part that's monetized, but more than half of the system is not monetized, and we need it. So acknowledging the interdependence between people that work for pay, people that don't work for pay, things we get for free, things that we have to pay for, like, these things are all intertwined. The more we devalue work by some, the cheaper the whole product is. We can make it more delicious, though. I'm sorry, Mike. I'm not really answering your question. I don't really know how to. Give me a little while and I'll think about it. That's a great question.
Thank you, Armine. The next question is from Kelly Dowdell. Who else do you look to as the storytellers or other voices that can dismantle the myths we've been sold these past 4 or 5 decades?
That's such a good question. I don't look to any particular storytellers. I gobble up the news. We subscribe in our home to many newspapers and magazines, and I'm always amazed at the brilliance of journalists, particularly investigative journalists, at being able to take something that has been dark and shed light on it. I said shift happens because shift is happening. Can you feel it? I certainly feel like something very big is happening. It feels like something is ending, but the next thing hasn't happened yet. It's the Gramsci idea of the interregnum, right? The old has died, but the new is not yet born. We're in that moment, and we could be shaping what happens next. And that's why I read with such voracious appetite. It's like something is happening. Maybe this next story is going to shed some light on a pattern. I'm looking for a pattern or something I can hook into. But there's so much that's happening, and so much of it is, I'm afraid to say, fake news. There's a lot of fake stories out there. Learning how to process the enormous volume of humanity that is transitioning right now. We're in the midst of history. The short answer to your question is there aren't individual storytellers that I pay attention to.
Thank you. We have a question from Doug Medjison. The Alberta government is keeping schools open, not reducing class sizes, but it does presumably allow more parents and women to continue wage work. Could you comment more on the complexity of this problem?
I would be delighted to. You are absolutely right that by keeping schools open, more women can engage in paid work, at least while the schools are open. Usually, childcare is a feature of this too. And I have no idea what is happening to your childcare system because there seems to be a deliberate effort to not talk about it. Anecdotally, it seems like a lot of families are finding it very difficult to find childcare, even if they had a spot. So the second part of the complexity of this is that because school class sizes have not been reduced, but schools are still open, because childcare in some instances is not available and in other instances is operating at full capacity when it shouldn't be, parents are choosing to keep their kids at home and homeschool them. And after 8 months, there are an increasing number of women who, if they can afford to, and it is always the woman, or almost always the woman, are throwing in the towel and saying, I can't do my paid job from home, homeschooling, and childcare. So something's got to give, and the thing that's going to give is my paid work. So guess what is going to happen with that story is households with children are going to have less income, and they are going to spend less. And I said earlier, they are the driver of the sector that fuels the economy. It is a very complex situation. And just by keeping the schools open so that mommy can work some more is not the only solution, because mommies are more than just workers. And they're recognizing that their kids may not be safe in school and are pulling them out. Expect to see more of that as the winter months progress and your infection rate climbs. I think you had over 1,000 cases in schools as of today. And I think between yesterday and today, 91 new cases just in one day in the school system. So something's happening in your province, and keeping the schools open, that's fine, but that's not changing the decisions that parents that can afford to do so are taking to pull their kids out of school. Just because the schools are open doesn't mean that the parents are going to have their kids in school. But if they don't have their kids in school, how are they doing their work? Lots of complex issues down the road. It's basically a every man and woman for themselves philosophy that is unfolding in Alberta. There's no there. There's no guidance. It's appalling, actually.
Thank you very much for these generous answers, Armine. We have another question here from Gemma Dunn about the nonprofit sector, which, as you suggested, can be a solution. However, public opinion is that the nonprofit sector is a drain on government and society when it's a big part of economic growth. How might we change that story?
I don't know that public opinion is that the nonprofit sector is a drain on the government. Actually, the nonprofit sector is delivering community and public services at a fraction of the cost, whereas it's more connected often to the community it serves. It is not necessarily, the nonprofit sector is sometimes a great employer and sometimes a terrible employer because of financial constraints. I don't think it's generally thought that they are a drain on the public sector. And they do provide services that otherwise would not be provided because the market doesn't provide it. Or if the market provides these services, people can't afford them. The thing about people not being able to afford services and turning to nonprofit human services is the thing I was talking about earlier. The deeper we get into this phase that is going to last for 4 decades of population aging, the more people are going to not be able to afford the basics. Nonprofit might be a growing part of our future if we acknowledge that that is a great way of providing more service to more people at an affordable price. But there are a lot of for-profit businesses that see the opportunity to make money. There's going to be less money to spend. So everybody's looking for the same dollar. And how are governments manage that tension between the businesses that want to make some money doing the things that people need, and then the people that can't afford those things getting access to the things that people need. That's going to be a really tricky thing to do in the coming years. If I was to place bets, and I'm not a betting type of girl, don't get me wrong, I would say that the future is going to be more nonprofit driven.
Thank you, Armine. A question from Patrick Collins. How do the rich shield themselves, and what can be done?
The rich shield themselves by rewriting the rules, by lobbying for rule changes, by lobbying for access to license. I mentioned that Bill 39, which is changing the rules for childcare, permits somebody that already has a license to share their license with somebody that didn't have a license. What the heck is that? That is nuts. Somebody lobbied for that change and got it. That's how the rich shield themselves. The rich shield themselves by saying, oh, if I'm not your employer, if I'm going through a temporary agency to get the employer, it's not my problem if something goes wrong. They use 2 and 3 separations of contracts to say, I'm not liable. Well, there are ways of getting around that. For example, joint and several liability under the law means that if you are contracting to get something done, it's not the contractor's fault that something happens. You have some joint liability in this process. For example, Loblaws. You may not know this, but if you eat mushrooms, a few years ago, Loblaws used to contract from 2 or 3 major growers. Those growers in Southern Ontario paid their workers $60,000 a year to be mushroom pickers. Then Loblaw said, but we want you to sell us these mushrooms that you've been selling us all along. Because it was skilled work and they had to do lots of really technical things in the mushroom farms where they were growing the mushrooms. When Loblaw said, I will buy your mushrooms, but you have to sell them for X amount less than you used to sell them to keep your contract. And because these growers were so dependent on that one contract, they fired all those workers and brought in temporary foreign workers that worked for a fraction of the price. So what used to be a good middle class job was turned into something only a migrant worker could afford to do because they were shacking up with many other people where they were living. And that is driven entirely by the supplier. If you're getting your mushrooms for $4.99 now instead of $5.99 or $6.99 a couple of years ago, that's part of the reason why. It's something I've been saying for years, which is the flip side of a cheap price is a cheap wage somewhere. And our desire to have things as cheap and as convenient as possible really pits ourselves as consumers against ourselves as workers in the long run. We are both consumers and workers. And the things we want as consumers are diametrically opposed to the things we want as workers. And it's just something we should keep in mind when we go shopping.
We have a question here from Rebecca Graf McRae, who is asking on behalf of her 11-year-old, who's learning a lot this week since she's been assigned a project to build her own country with government, economic, and social structures. She has outlined a universal basic services model, but she wants to know if it can be effective and realistic, and how can her government pay for it without huge taxes? Thank you, from Sorcha.
Dear Sorcha, can I work for you when you become Prime Minister of your country? I will move. If you give me a passport, I will move to your country. Yes, a universal basic services model is possible. It can be effective and realistic. Exhibit A, healthcare. So in the United States, it is not universal and it is not basic. They spend more than any other country in the world per capita, and they still have people that are not covered by basic hospital and doctor's services. It is ineffective and also realistic because that's what they chose to do. But here in Canada, we don't have a perfect universal healthcare system, but it is cheaper than the Americans and more people are healthier. Thank you, Sorcha. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to send you my email so that as soon as she becomes Prime Minister, I want a passport. It's not just healthcare that's like that. The more you make people healthy and educated, the better they can do, the more they can grow. It is effective, it is realistic, and it pays for itself. It's got huge returns on investment when people are well housed, well-educated, healthy, and have the ability to communicate with one another and know they are being treated the same as everybody else in a system, right? The same access to justice, the same access to education, the same access to internet, that there's a level playing field that makes your effort meaningful. Outcomes will not always be equal, but inputs can be more equal. The other thing I want to say is I'm so thrilled that you're talking about a universal basic services model, because everybody else is talking about universal basic income, which number one, we're never going to get. We've been talking about it for hundreds of years. It's one of those more legs than a bucket of chicken. It just keeps coming at you, but it never arrives. It is one of these ideas that we literally cannot afford in the era of population aging, because we've got so many fewer workers. But what we can afford, and what would build solidarity, even though we would be paying a little bit more out of taxes, we would be paying a lot less out of pocket for a lot better system. So you are on it, Sorcha. You are totally on it. Congratulations.
So I think we have time for 2 more questions. The first is from Rebecca Stendy. So Armine, what is your suggestion to municipalities in Alberta to help their communities recover when the provincial policies and funding are not conducive to actual recovery?
I hate federalism. I hate this governance bind we are in. I don't have great solutions other than perhaps to revitalize. Remember the cities roundtable? We were talking about the cities roundtable in the 80s, but it depends on who the government of Canada is, but there is some openness to having cities projects. But for smaller municipalities in Alberta, my friend, unless you can organize municipalities to lobby the provincial government or the federal government, you are up a creek. And I know, believe me, I know that the politics of municipalities at the provincial level is all over the map. May I just say, yesterday, 24 hours ago, Waterloo Region, which is in southwestern Ontario, and actually the seat of a great university and a tech hub, Waterloo Region City Council, or Waterloo Regional Council, voted to defund childcare so it could increase the budget for their police services. Like, they need a lot more police services in Waterloo Region. What the heck is going on in Waterloo Region? They cut childcare services to do this. So can I just say, all municipalities are not cut from the same cloth. It is very difficult to herd these cats together, but without actually lobbying together, you're not going to get much done either at the provincial or the federal level. And you are really up a creek with the government that you're dealing with right now. Sorry, that's the best I can do.
Our last question will go to our director, Trevor Harrison.
You timed that, didn't you?
Perfectly. So given changes in the nature of work due to globalization and automation, for example, do we need to reconceptualize what we mean by work?
Well, that's a great question. I think the changes in the nature of work due to technology are going to reconceptualize what we mean by work. I think even the pandemic has showed us that there's more of a blurring of the lines between work and life than we've seen prior to this. But the things that are what we really need to reconceptualize is not because of globalization or technology, but because the system isn't working for too many people. We need to reconceptualize what it is how we value each other's work. I think we do need to reconceptualize what we mean by work, but not because of globalization and technology, but because our map of how work defines us is misleading us and guiding us in the wrong direction. We shouldn't be devoted to work. We should be devoted to the ones we love and start from there.
That was great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Armine, for your replies and also this important and passionate talk, for teaching us and reminding us that a caring economy and its workers are so crucial. And so in closing, to continue providing events like this one, and doing the research that we do at the Parkland. And in case you missed it the first time I said it, we need your support. And so if you're not already a supporter, we ask that you click on the link in the chat and consider helping out the Parkland if you can. We will also be sending out a survey after the conference, and we look forward to hearing your feedback. As we mentioned before, HSAA has provided support so that this talk and others have been recorded. Once the recordings are edited and our technical support team at the Faculty of Arts Resource Center has done its work, it will be placed up on the Parkland YouTube channel. Thank you again for being here. Armine, thank you for this talk and for conversing with us. And I hope everyone has a good evening.